A few years back, I spent a day interviewing a hermit of sorts who had lived for decades off-grid and without water or electricity in an unbelievably remote spot in northeastern Nevada. For someone ostensibly committed to not interacting with others, I was struck by how welcoming, friendly, and eager to talk he was, an extreme version of stereotypical rural hospitality. But interspersed in our hours of conversation were glimpses of suspicion of the outside world and extreme prejudice against outsiders or anyone different. It was a paradox I've since struggled to understand. Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brennan Rensing, and today I talk with Navied Mahdavian, a cartoonist and author of the graphic novel memoir, This Country, Searching for Home in Very Rural America. His experience as an Iranian-American moving to rural Idaho brought clarity to the paradox of the Nevada hermit, the contradictory multitudes we all contain, and some of the conflicting best and worst attributes sometimes associated with Westerners. Thanks for listening.
For new listeners, allow me to take a moment to explain a bit about Writing Westward and myself. Each episode features a conversation with people writing about the North American West: historians, journalists, novelists, poets, scientists, sociologists, and others. By showcasing their work, I hope to spark your curiosity to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the peoples who call it home. If a writer or topic intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. And if you have a moment, please do subscribe, share links with friends, leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you're using to listen, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and send in some feedback. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brennan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and an Associate Professor of History. For better or worse, this is a one-man operation, with me playing role of host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, all tasks for which I have no training. But I am passionate about the North American West, so this difficult work is well worth the excuse to read more books and talk to interesting people. At the end of each episode, I'll include a little bit more information about me and my scholarship and about the Redd Center, our public programming and projects and funding opportunities that you could apply for. With that, let me introduce a little bit more about today's guest and why we're talking to them.
Navied Mahdavian is a cartoonist and writer whose work has appeared in The New Yorker since 2018. You may have also seen his work in Reader's Digest, Wired, and elsewhere. He currently lives in Salt Lake City with his wife and daughter, but he arrived via Miami, San Francisco, and very rural Idaho. His graphic novel, This Country, Searching for Home in Very Rural America, was published in 2023 by Princeton Architectural Press. This book illustrates, literally, his experience moving from the urban Bay Area to Idaho. It explores how his identity as an Iranian-American complicated his experience there, and what it taught him about both rural and Western identities. It is funny, occasionally profane, warning, and deeply moving. For those who feel that they belong in the West, or wherever they live for that matter, Mahdavian's work is an excellent reminder that not all feel so. Thankfully, we hold, both collectively and individually, significant power to change that, to make all feel welcome, especially those who don't look, sound, or share background with majority populations. We indeed can help others find home and belonging, just as we have. Navied Mahdavian, welcome to Writing Westward.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to talk about your book. I've been wanting to do some kind of graphic novel of some sort, and I've been waiting for one to kind of pop up. And when yours came across my desk, I was just really excited. I was like, no, this is the one. This is it.
Yeah. Graphic memoir about the West.
Yeah, there's not many. It's a small category. Well, I think I'd like to spend most of our conversation today kind of hearing about your experience with the quote-unquote West, be it urban or suburban or rural or extra rural. I don't know what the stage beyond normal rural is. That's kind of where it seems that you were.
Yeah. I think in the title it's parentheses very rural.
Yeah. Yeah. But also I want to kind of hear about your thoughts about kind of Western identity and Western culture. And there's a lot of really fascinating kind of moments in your book that will be really great entry points to that. But first, we kind of need to get to know a little bit about you, because it's a memoir, so you're a big part of this. Your parents emigrated from Iran in 1978. But you grew up in the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about where you grew up, where your upbringing was?
Yeah, grew up in the Big 305, Miami, Florida, which is not as glamorous as Will Smith made it sound in his song. Just the suburbs, and went to University of Miami there after high school, and then moved to the West Coast. So the West, but not the West. Lived in LA and then the San Francisco Bay Area for about 7 years, where I went to grad school, was a teacher, fifth grade teacher for a number of years, and then decided I wanted to become a cartoonist, and that's what precipitated the move to Idaho.
So growing up in Miami, what was your awareness of the West? Did it speak to you culturally? Was it just a caricature from, movies and video games? How did you think about it? Let's say, especially then, as you eventually were thinking of, you moved out to California. What was your relationship with the region?
Yeah, I think a caricature. Interestingly enough, when my parents first moved to the United States, they moved to Oklahoma. And I remember, and I mentioned this in the book, my dad buys a cowboy hat in order to fit in, and my mom was like, I feel like I'm in a movie. There are the cowboy hats and the ranchers, and she just always said how surreal it felt.
This was Stillwater,
to be on
right?
what felt like this. Yeah, this is Stillwater. And so growing up in Miami, I think my conception of the West was probably like a lot of people on the coast's conception of it. I mean, really heavily formed by movies and books, and which was one of the pleasant surprises when I first visited Mackay, the town. It's unnamed in the book, but when we first visited there on a whim, the rodeo was going on, and so it really did feel like an introduction to the West that matched up with what my perception of the West was. And obviously living there for 3 years, it wasn't always a rodeo. But
that's just funny that that was going on.
Yeah.
During your first moments there. Cause wow, it really is
Yeah. But I think I imagine that's what many people's conception of the West is like when you're living on the coast.
Well, I think even for a lot of people living in the West, so much of Western identity is really wrapped up kind of in that popular culture. So did you fit in at the rodeo?
Surprisingly, no. I had made the poor decision before traveling. When I was packing, I packed up all the clothing that I hadn't already laundered, and it's the things that's at the bottom of the drawer that you hope you never make it to in the laundry cycle. But threw those into the luggage. And when we're standing at the rodeo, you have all of your cowboys with their cowboy hats on and their giant rodeo buckles and their big working dogs. And I had my dog Stanley, who's a Chihuahua Jack Russell mix. And my clothing, I had the American Apparel Deep V t-shirts that I hadn't worn in a couple of years, and these skinny jeans. And I clearly, I did not fit in and match, the sort of archetypal Western cowboy, this conception of masculinity. And over the course of the 3 years that I was there, I did find that there was this constant negotiation. I mean, it wasn't always. I got to know the cowboys, and so got to see behind that sort of veneer of masculinity and get to know the people behind it. But there was this negotiation between that idea of masculinity and
maybe less V-neck tees and skinny jeans.
Less V-neck. Yeah. Although I do remember there was this one time I was on 6 acres, had no neighbors for the first year, so it really was just like hundreds of acres, and so I was never expecting somebody to come to my door. And I remember I was there by myself, and there was a knock on the door. So I'm surprised, open it up, and I realize I'm on. No, there was a knock on the door, and I was on the swing outside the porch reading. Somebody knocks on the door and I poke my head around the corner, and it is this cowboy who was looking for my neighbor, and I realize I'm in this like oversized onesie. So it's like this like patterned mint green onesie that has like the the flap in the back and has the big hood, and I'm there with my book, and I'm like, no, you want like the house that's 2 miles down. But it was, I can't imagine a greater contrast between.
He just saw like an alien. He's like, what is going on here?
He was like, I don't think this is the house I'm looking for.
I went to a very small rural Idaho rodeo once with my in-laws, and my wife had got me this T-shirt, and printed on the T-shirt was like pearly snap buttons and kind of like the little rose motif on the shoulders that looks like an old like classic Western button-up shirt, but it was just a T-shirt like screen printed on. And so I wore that, and some people got the joke and thought it was hilarious, and then some people just gave me a lot of side eye.
Yeah.
Like, are you making fun of us? And I wasn't. Like, I actually have quite a few like pearly snap Western shirts. They're kind of like retro and hip now, but
yeah. That's funny.
So when you go to LA and San Francisco, did you think about that at the time as like, oh, I've moved to the West, or was the coast just something fully different for you in your mind?
I don't remember what I thought at the time, but in retrospect, it really is. It's coast to coast, and I feel in retrospect that there was this sort of seamless transition because there was that jarring culture shock when I moved to the quote unquote West. It's kind of like growing up in Miami when you say when you go north, you're going to the South. And so being on the West Coast, when you're moving east, you're going to the West. And I am an Iranian American, and I address in the book some of the cultural gaps and the things that you might expect from that sort of like quote unquote east meets West. But I do think that it was the big city versus small town culture gap that played out more often than the Middle Eastern versus white American, where there was this, I think, constant suspicion of the Californication of Idaho, of big city people moving in. And I'm sure we can talk about this more further on in the interview. But and I think some of those fears were real and founded. If most of the community were ranchers, and so I understand when you have like thousands of acres, real estate prices going up is devastating to your business. And then other times where it just did feel very political and that sort of culture war-y thing where it just made it felt less sort of like economics and more, we don't like your type here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I grew up in Northwest Washington, and there was a constant talk about, oh, the Californians are all moving up here.
Yeah.
And recently on a local history Facebook page, there's just been like all the comments are about like, oh, these Californians. Yeah. There's, and I think a lot of that though is, interestingly, the West per capita is the most urban and suburban region of the United States. We think of it as a rural because there is so much wide open rural spaces, but in terms of where the population actually lives, we're more suburban and urban than other regions. Some of Westerners' identity is still really rooted to that rural world. Anyways, it plays out in weird ways, I think. But I do think you're right. A lot of the tension often maybe talked about as, oh, these outsiders coming to the West or whatever. But I think a lot of times it is more urban, rural. That's the tension.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. Yeah. Christopher Haight. I don't know if you're familiar with Christopher Haight. I think that's how you say his name. He has a couple of books that I read, and I remember him in one of them talking about how, I forget what the study was, and this is how all great anecdotes start. Like, somebody said this one thing, I don't remember what the study was, but he talks about how people in cities, even internationally, so like Shanghai to LA to Paris, have more in common than people in urban cities due to rural communities in their own country. And I mentioned before the interview started that I've been doing some traveling, and I definitely feel like there is this ease of transition when I'm moving from, even like Salt Lake to London, to Paris, than I do when moving from Salt Lake or San Francisco into more rural.
Yeah, especially like in the rhythms of kind of everyday life. In the city, you can just run to the corner store to grab whatever you need. Living in a remote cabin in Idaho, you have to plan out your daily, weekly, monthly life quite different. And your book, really, in very many humorous ways, kind of highlights maybe how unprepared or a little naive you guys may have been, right? Like showing up and your truck won't start because it's too cold, so you can't get into town to get food. You didn't have wood to chop to warm the home. All kinds of
I did not know it could get to negative 37 degrees, but it did, and it stayed.
So what led you guys? You said that you had traveled. You'd been to kind of a rodeo there in the area. Had you traveled much around other places in the rural West, or what was it that led you to then decide, hey, we're going to buy this acreage and build a cabin here?
Good question. Summer before, we had been planning a trip. I was on Airbnb, scrolled over Idaho randomly. Neither of us had been to that part of the country. And so I found a very cute Airbnb and went there. And we went there for a week, and immediately, fell in love with the town and the mountains, and the people that we met. And when we started looking up real estate in the area, it was much more affordable than some, we could not hope to afford something in the Bay Area. And we weren't those California folk who were moving in with all of their money. I was a teacher. Emily, my wife, was a doctoral student. So I had to empty out my retirement plan from teaching in order to be able to purchase the land. And we built a very small, tiny house that was off the grid. But initially it felt like a place that we could go to escape in the summers. But I was burnt out on teaching, and we realized that we had this place that we could go to where we would have no overhead. She wanted to become a documentary filmmaker. I wanted to pursue being a cartoonist, and it just felt like the right time. And as you mentioned, I think in some ways we were very prepared. Emily is, she's great with her spreadsheets. She designed the house, knew the ins and outs of off the grid living, but I feel like there's only so much you can know before you go in. Particularly, you can get the meta level, but then when you get to the day-to-day, what you described as the rhythm, I feel like that's something that you can only really know once you are there. And I describe it in the book as the land operating on the body. And almost immediately, once you're there, it's transformative, right? You embody it, and that's only something, for good or bad, that we could get once we were sort of boots on the ground, cowboy boots on the ground there.
What expectations did you have for the culture that you were going to encounter?
It might be described as naive. We're both fans of Northern exposure, which I don't know if you or your listeners have. Yeah, so it's for the people who haven't listened. Jewish doctor has to go to Alaska to pay off his loans, and so it's classic fish out of water. And I think that in my mind, moving there was going to be like that, where we would have this would be meet all these kooky characters, all get up into these antics, have these transformative and moving experiences, find ourselves, and in some ways, I think that we did realize that over the course of the 3 years that we were there. But we moved in November 2016, right after, Trump's election. And so there was some trepidation in that move. But I think I did feel that 6 acres that we would own worst came to worst, like it would be this buffer where we would have our home. We could pursue what we wanted to pursue, hopefully make some friends, even if the community itself never felt like home. So I think it was a mixture of naivete and, trepidation. But I don't know, we were like hopeful and it was romantic and we were going on an adventure. And I think every adventure has its ups and downs. And so there were ups and downs.
Yeah. So you spent 3 years there. You built this cabin. You try to do some gardening. And I think my mom and you could talk a lot about deer eating everything out of her garden.
Yeah, when deer go from being something that's really cute that you take photos off to things that you're, screaming at in your underwear at 3 a.m.
Yep. Yeah. Where I grew up, there's a lot of kind of suburban deer now. And they just like every morning they're laying out in the yard and the fawns are really cute and everything. But then my mom's complaining, oh, they all my tulips, or, whatever it was.
Yeah.
When I grew up, we did have a garden with some corn and beans and other things. And it was always the raccoons. The raccoons would strip everything like the night before we were going to go harvest. Every single, like they knew it was ready. But so you do gardening, you're living off grid with solar panels. There's kind of like a lot of kind of ecological intentional awareness kind of, it seems, to what you were doing. You try running a single screen cinema for a while.
Yeah.
Then the narrative kind of shifts to your guys's decision to have a child and kind of the long and difficult process that was. And then you eventually do. You have your daughter there. So I'm curious, like kind of through that, what about this Western setting and this place were you most excited about, like making this like my home? And then especially like, what about the place were you looking forward to saying like, this is where we're going to like build a family and we're going to raise our daughter and have her become who she's going to become? Like, what about the setting held the most promise for that?
Yeah, I think like going back to the question of this like coastal conception of the West, I think it's hard not to see those mountains, to be in a place like that and to be caught up in this idea of like, freedom and the open space and homesteading and, doing something on the fringes of, like the sort of like the American myth of the West. And I definitely think there was a seed of that in our decision to move out there because, we could have bought something that was small and had a backyard to do some gardening. But there was something to the sort of the dust that we encountered when we were out there, and the challenge of turning dust into something that we could live off of. And people often ask, what is the thing that I miss most about there now that I'm back in a city? And I think it is that the rhythm that you spoke to, and the quiet and the space and this sense of like opportunity, where it's just like it's you and the land, and the community is 500 people 20 minutes away. And so there was that aspect, and I'll speak to that in a moment. But in terms of most of my day-to-day was in sort of building out from scratch, and it really was just like dust. There was some sagebrush, but the land, as far as we know, it had been used to raise bucking broncos. So it's just like overgrazed, and it really was just trying to turn dust into sort of like life. And I think that's that sort of romantic idea that we moved to the West, what we had in mind, and this idea of starting a family there, right? Like we had space. And even though I am like a city boy and I've returned to the city, I could appreciate what it would be like to raise a child in a place like that, where she had, room to run and, to explore. And, just within the first couple of years of my being there, like I learned the names of the birds, and I got into like birding before it was pandemic cool, and the names of like the local, the flora and the fauna, and just this way of seeing the land that is radically different than what you experience in the city. And I do miss that. And that is one of those areas where I did find I was leaning on the community, right? Because the people who had lived there their entire lives, whose families went back 150 years, their experience of the land was so much deeper than anything I could have hoped to have developed over those 3 years. And they knew the names of birds. And I remember my neighbor, who I called John in Jim in the book, as we would be driving around somewhere, he would just like stop because, there were some like, ducks that he was looking at, or he thought that he could see some elks on the side of the mountain, and things that I would just completely have missed. They were always there for him. And so it was just this way of being that I just thought was just, it felt like this is the way we're supposed to live, right? This is the rhythm. And like, there's a way that cities seem to just flatten space and time. Like you go from point A to point B, and being in a place like that, you could just wander. And, I think the Frank Church Wilderness is the largest space in the contiguous United States that's roadless.
Yep.
And it's just like, that's it. This is what you do. And so like, it just felt like the place to put down roots, to start a family. And then obviously, after 3 years, we do make the decision to leave.
It's not because you had fallen out of love with the land and
no.
the trees and the birds and
definitely not. There was the realization about how much harder, and it really was like homesteading light. Like we didn't have any animals, and we did have, I think at the most, like 23 raised beds, some of which were like 5 feet by 20 feet. We were trying to raise everything that we could. But it really, like the most extreme weather. Remember the first June that we were there, I planted our squash, and then the next day there was 4 inches of snow, and my neighbors showed up and they like laughed that we had a lot to learn, but by the end we had sort of figured it out. We had learned about, hoops, and we had a cold frame, and there was that rhythm and like the trial and error that went into figuring out how to grow, peppers and beans, and like finally got our potatoes. But there was that difficulty that I think it was that like the romantic image of homesteading with then the realities of doing it in a place that just felt so inhospitable. And I got why so much of agriculture there was ranching, where you would just put your cattle out to graze in the mountains, and why so many people would have their small gardens, but like that sort of homesteading just wasn't the norm. The growing season was so short and extreme.
There's easier places to homestead.
Exactly. Yeah. But then there was the cultural gap, which I think at the end of the day, having our daughter, and I speak to this in the book, my wife is white American, and so our daughter is biracial. And so by being there, we had made the choice to be okay with certain moments of alienation. But by staying there, we would be making that decision for our daughter. And I felt like my parents made the decision to move from Oklahoma to Miami, a place that was much more diverse, a place where I never felt like I stood out, because everybody's family had come from somewhere else and was varying shades of brown. And so I felt like it was the least that I could do for my daughter. And I'm sure had we stayed there, my daughter would have had a wonderful, childhood. But it wasn't necessarily the culture that, that I wanted her to grow up into. And that's one of the things that I try to address in the book. I feel like it's very easy as an outsider, as a city folk, to move into a place like that and to point fingers and to point out all the things that like, this is what's wrong with this place. And I did find that there were certain elements that I felt like I had to critique, but at the end of the day, it wasn't my culture. And because it's not my culture, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the culture. And there were certain things about it that I loved. But it just, I think, wasn't the culture that I wanted to raise, my daughter in.
I can sense, like in the book, there's like, there's so many panels, like you walking around in the woods,
Yeah.
like, looking at the birds, talking about the different phases of the moon, just like all of this kind of outdoorsy stuff that really seems to have struck. I mean, at one point, I think you said something like, um, I've shed my city madness.
Yeah.
Like it was like being out there, like it was transforming you. You were,
Oh, yeah.
like, and it's regenerative, and it's all kinds of things, which would all be great for raising kids.
Oh, totally.
But you had some cultural things and some other things to try to balance, and I can tell that. So I think in the book, like that tension and kind of the grief and the it wasn't easy decisions to make.
No,
by leaving, you were gaining things for your daughter, but there was things that you were gonna miss.
For
so
sure.
Maybe this is like the kind of the topic, this paradox of kind of your sociality with rural Western neighbors. On the one hand, so open, so kind, generous, warm, helpful, which I are all kind of like stereotypes of rural hospitality, and but simultaneously these moments of extreme closed-mindedness, prejudice, conspiratorial thinking, even. What do you think about kind of like, let's talk about like the best then of these cultural things, of kind of like the welcoming, warm, generous nature of rural Western Americans as you met them? Was that something you were expecting?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you said it's like a stereotype. I mean, you see that in the movies, right? The welcoming, that small town ethos. And I think from the get-go, our first interaction, our neighbors, Jim and Angie, coming onto our, we're just camping out on our property, and they show up with, wine glasses and wine, and are just very, welcoming. They're welcoming us to the quote unquote neighborhood, even though we were like the only two people within, a few square miles. But then immediately, they ask like, oh, well, we were debating where your name is from, which like in different contexts can be fine. Or, in this context feels a little like, well, one, they already know who you are, which in small towns, I immediately, I quickly learned everybody who knows who you are. There's only 500 people. So any new faces are going to be of interest. And then so there's like that hesitation, and I say, and she's like, oh, I think it was like, oh, I thought it was like Lebanese, and he thought it was Iraqi, and I said, oh, my parents are from Iran, and her response was like, oh, that's okay, which I thought was like a very funny, response. And then Jim launches into about how ISIS is here, and I'm like, ISIS, and he says yes, that they have training camps here. So there's some of that conspiratorial stuff, but I feel like that encounter set me up for that push and pull, and that the twin sides of the sort of welcoming and then the not welcoming. And I think in many of my encounters while I was there was always that question of like, how is this conversation going to turn? And for the most part, the conversations always turned out like great. I mean, and I got that there was. I feel like people are people, and when you know people on a personal level, like people are, they're kind and welcoming, and I got while being there though that it also is. There's a reason why small communities and places like that, I think like that's the culture. You're dependent on one another. There were many occasions where I was stuck in the snow or like ran out of firewood, or they or other neighbors would just like check in on us, and then we would do the same where like they needed help and we were there, which I think just gave me a greater appreciation for where some of I'm like a typical like coastal like liberal, but like I sort of got that sort of libertarian Republican streak by being there, where if your family's been there for 150 years, I can't imagine what it was like being a rancher in like 1860 in the middle of nowhere, Idaho. Like, what does the federal government have to do with you? Like, it's you and your own and your community, and you're dependent on one another, and you support one another, and you don't have some of the sort of like the issues of homelessness and poverty that you get in cities. And so there's some of that, I think, like cultural, political disconnect where they don't then understand what's happening in urban areas and the problems that urban communities face. But it did give me some appreciation because I got like a glimpse behind political views that I don't usually, agree with. I got to see like the sort of the kind people that hold those views, and then also some appreciation for where those views might come from, even if at the end of the day I didn't agree with, because like a community like that is also dependent on federal and state funding because, they can't, they support themselves without it. So there were those, I think there's a complexity to it that I feel like I was able to understand and appreciate after 3 years.
Do you feel like your neighbors were self-aware or self-aware of this welcomeness? Is this something that was intentionally, consciously thought about? Like, no, we take care of each other. Like, is this something that was on people's tongues?
I remember being in the car the summer when we were just visiting. The Airbnb hosts were driving us around to go shoot guns. And I remember being in the car with them and they would wave to everybody who would drive by. And I had never seen this being in a city. If you tried to wave at everybody, right, that would just be, your hand would just be constantly up and they would think you're a weirdo. But there, I remember he was driving and he didn't wave and she was like, wave, and like, I got it, where it was like you're this thing that we are trying to keep up, right? Like, because if you don't do those things and like the threads of community, right, it's like it's important to maintain those. And I got some of that while I was there, where it was this like, I think like conscious effort to maintain this sense of community, these relationships, which is why I think like I didn't understand, like growing up in Salt Lake City, there is the Founders Day parade. Growing up in Miami, we didn't have parades. San Francisco, I guess there's like the Pride Parade. But like those sorts of like community events where everybody shows up, like the barbecue and the rodeo. I got it because one, it's something to do, but it's also, those are the sort of the ties that bind. And so I definitely do think that like they emphasized those events and they also prided themselves on this sort of welcomingness and this sense of community, even if when you say like a self-awareness, I think there was an awareness in that regard, but then there wasn't an awareness in things that they would do or say that might be alienating.
But this does give context, though, to their suspicion of outsiders. Like, because if these community relationships and, connections are so important, outsiders coming in, like, it could threaten that. It could really disrupt this community that works in a certain way because of how they treat each other and help each other. And I mean, so like it's like kind of what you're talking about. It's like it's empathy. You gained empathy for them. Like you may not agree with all of their views, but you can start to see like, oh, I get why they're so suspicious of outsiders. All right,
and I hope that there was on the flip side this empathy that maybe they developed, where I know for many of them I was probably the first Middle Eastern American that they had met. A friend of mine was visiting from New York one time. He's Jewish, and somebody who I knew there who was in his 50s, he had said, "Oh, I've never met a Jewish person before," and so I know that for some people they feel like, oh well, like that's not like a burden I need to shoulder. That's not my responsibility. But there was this way that I thought that like this cultural exchange that I thought was happening, and I do hope that I can be like a representative for like Middle Easterners, for those members of the community who, whose first interaction with a Middle Eastern American was with me. And I know that for some of them, I had these conversations where people were like, well, surely like you and your family, they're the exception, when talking about immigrants. And it's like, why are we the exception? Like, why are like those terrible things you're pointing out? Why are those the exception? So I don't know how much empathy or of a lasting impression I may have made, but I hope so. I mean, because like they definitely did leave an impression on me, and so I'm hoping that there was that, that sort of exchange as well.
But I mean, obviously, if they were saying like, oh, but obviously you guys are the exception, like like it demonstrates the power of actually just getting to know someone. And
Totally.
you may have approached them with all kinds of preconceived notions about what rural Americans
Sure.
would be like, and they probably dispelled some of those. And hopefully, like you're saying, the inverse as well. I'm always frustrated, in kind of contemporary political discourse that, and I think this also applies to kind of this rural versus urban tension, that we're often just arguing past each other. We talk past each other.
Oh, for sure.
We don't ever actually engage. And if we actually would just sit down and engage, we find out we have a lot of actually mostly shared. Like, we're all humans. Like, we generally want the same things, but
I think one of the interesting realizations while I was there, like I remember the county commissioner or the city commissioner was a Democrat, and he was like the sort, when you'd see him, he was like an older guy, had the suspenders, was a sort of like old school, Democrat, and he was the person who was elected at the local level, and the county itself, or the voting district, had voted 90% Trump, which I thought was like, that was just like so fascinating, which like at a local level, because like at the end of the day, we want to make sure like water's going where it needs to go, and like local stuff is, things that needs to be happening are happening, but it's
the culture
just
wars
when,
don't
like,
play into that.
Exactly.
And so if this guy who's a Democrat is the one who's going to get stuff done, then we'll let him get stuff done.
Exactly. And then they would start talking about the border, and it's like, the border's 1,500 miles from you. Like, why is that a question? Like, why are you concerned about like why is ISIS one of the first things you were bringing up, or like bathroom bills, when like these are not things, but it's just like these pernicious narratives that sort of seep into the conversations and the culture. And it was difficult because on the one hand, I think that we make connections and like strides when we're having those conversations with people who we have developed relationships with. But then I also did feel like there was only so far that those conversations could go, because Emily, my wife, she was much more comfortable having political conversations where like I would sort of like turn into myself and like, go into my shell. And I would just like nod my head as these conversations continued, because
and as a white woman, she had some privilege and
totally
could engage in those conversations from a very different place than you could, because of all these projections that were being placed upon you, right?
Yeah.
You have to be much more careful about what you say, because like you're saying, like you're kind of a representative. Like, I'm the first Middle Eastern American they've ever met.
Yeah.
So like, I don't want to feed into their worst suspicion. I mean, much more fraught for you than Emily.
Yeah. So there's a lot of head nodding, and it does feel better to be in a city where like I'm not there isn't that constant negotiation. But then I also do feel like there were like those moments of silence where somebody who I was sitting with, like a friend, would say something that is and in the book I there's a scene where this happens, where they say like very racist things, and I don't know how to respond, and so I'm just silence. But then like there's that recognition of the silence, and in the scene with Jim, after saying the N-word and the F-word with a friend of his that we're visiting, he's like, well, that's just what we call him here, as if to excuse using that language. But there were a few occasions where this happened, where there was that sort of like that silence that then prompted them to respond, well, like, oh, that probably sounded a little racist. And I think in part it's because there isn't that pushback usually. And I think maybe in part that's why they felt comfortable saying those things in front of me, where it's, I guess like I'm like one of the gang, even though like I don't look the same. But then I also think this is just the way that we talk, and there isn't that pushback because everybody agrees with us. Yeah. And I think that in the cities, we also take that for granted as well when we have conversations where everyone's going to agree with what we're saying. And so I think that those silences, that there was this realization that like, oh, maybe he doesn't speak about it in this way, or maybe like this isn't going to be as well received as it would have been. And so I felt like those were like helpful, pauses and silences.
These seem like these are the things that kind of just pile up, that you write that eventually like the cabin did feel like home.
Yeah.
But you wrote, but I'm a visitor in this place.
Yeah.
That's a hard tension to kind of then sit with long term. So you've since moved to Salt Lake City, which is its own very peculiar brand of West.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, so now kind of living in and different, although I would be curious if now looking back on your San Francisco and LA experience, if you can see quote unquote Western things from San Francisco that you hadn't recognized as Western then, or are there things now in Salt Lake that you think you view through a Western lens differently than you would have if you had just moved from Miami to LA to San Francisco to Salt Lake? Like, does this Idaho interlude, has it changed how you view the urban West?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely the sort of the physical markers, right? The mountains that surround Salt Lake that remind me of the mountains and where we were in rural Idaho. And so it definitely does feel in that way like the West. Although now, within the 3 years I was in Idaho, I became very outdoorsy and spent lots of time there. And now I sort of appreciate the outdoors from my climate control department as I'm drawing. I just like look at the snow falling on the mountains. I don't feel the need to go into them. But I do feel like cities are cities. And, I don't do the ambling. I don't do the wandering. I drive, in my plug-in electric car from, my apartment to Whole Foods and back. And so I feel like in some ways the experience of a city is very similar. But then, like, looking back on my time in San Francisco, I mean, I feel like a lot of the language, right? I mean, there is like the Donner Pass and streets that are named after, like, like the missions, and like there is this the myth of like the moving out west, and that I think pervades everywhere in the West, whether it's the cities or the rural areas. But I honestly, though, I think that it more than anything, it feels like a city, and that also might be in some ways a sigh of relief, because as much as I enjoyed living in rural America, there is this relief of being back in the city of like the familiar. And even though Salt Lake City is not this booming metropolis, it is growing, and there are all of the hallmarks of the city that I depend on and I appreciate. Being able to go to shows and having more than a couple of restaurants to go to, and just like the things to do.
Have you noticed a difference in your interactions though? So it seems like even though you were out in a kind of a remote cabin, like you knew your neighbors and you knew people in the community. But when you live in a city, it's very easy. You can go years and years and years without really on a deep interpersonal level actually interacting with anyone.
Yeah. Well, and I remember being the one of the culture shocks of being in Mackay was this idea of visiting, which is a term now that I hear often, but at the time was new to me. Like, I'm going to visit, and where you just like you sort of slow down, and like I remember people would be like working on something like the well, and somebody would show up and it would be a friend of the well guy, and the well guy would take an hour break to just like chat, to visit with his friend.
Yeah.
And like I would get annoyed, but then like I got it, because that's just part of the culture. Like, you're driving and you see somebody and you visit with them.
We don't do that in the city.
Like, no, in the city it's like you want the plumber or the well guy, whoever, to come in, and like you nod at them and you grunt and you exchange, money, and then they move on and you continue doing your thing. And like you want that anonymity, like, and so I do miss that element of it. And I think one of the things that I realized in the book, and it's one of the things that ironically drove us out of Mackay and back into the city, was this pursuit of home. And when we moved there, as I had said, I thought if worse comes to worse, we at least have like our tiny home and our 6 acres, and that would act as a buffer. But I think now my conception of home is like these ever widening concentric circles where you have like your family and your home and your land, and then like the community and like the people that exist in that community. And so moving to a new place like Salt Lake, I definitely have made an effort to get to know the people who run like the local businesses, and like, because that is part of the community. And I still may not know on a personal level the people who live in my apartment building, but I do know the people who run the coffee shop. And, you know, I recognize.
Is this like in ways that you maybe wouldn't have if
Yeah,
you hadn't gone through
yeah.
Idaho?
I think definitely, because
So it changed you.
Yeah, for sure, because I think it just made me appreciate that element, that of home, because that is part of your home. And so there are, you know, I mean, there are too many businesses around where we are to get to know everybody, but I feel like I have definitely gotten to know, because I still do go on walks. And, you know, I think that's, every parent does that with their kid, but I also, as a writer and a cartoonist, walks are important to me, and that is a habit that I developed while I was out there. And even if I'm not like walking in nature, I'm still walking the you know, around my community and in the streets and sidewalks and around the businesses. So I think it's natural then to get to know the people who you're passing by, and that's definitely not something I did in the Bay Area or in Miami.
I think that's maybe one of the best aspects of, if we can stereotype rural America in various ways, like one of the best things about it. So that's great that you.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
That you took that with you. So if there's, you know, listeners who are, you know, Westerners, be it rural or urban, and they, you know, either listen to this and, you know, hopefully go pick up your book, what would you hope that they learn, or what kind of perspectives are you thinking would be important for them to gain?
I think part of it is what you had mentioned earlier, was like, there are important conversations that need to happen. And you can only have those conversations if you get to know somebody on a personal level. And I hope that there was a sort of cultural exchange, you know, having these complex political conversations, because we live in like increasingly like a divisive time. And like you said, we're talking past one another. And there were those moments, as much as I shied away from having those conversations, that, you know, they were inevitable. And I think that it helped soften me to those conversations and to the people that hold views I don't agree with. And I hope that it did it for them as well. And so I think the takeaway that I hope that people have is to have those conversations, to make friends with people who don't, you know, have the same background as you. And, you know, I did make many friendships while I was there. And we eventually sold our home last year, but on those trips that I'd make back, I have the friends who I would see, and even those friends who I didn't see, and that they were friendships of circumstance, I lean on now when like things are just seeming increasingly crazy. I'm like, oh, they were like really nice people who probably believe those crazy things. And they're not terrible people. And I hope that they don't think that people who held my beliefs are terrible people, because I think things get really nasty when you just think that people are terrible.
Well, maybe we need to get the government to fund some kind of rural urban exchange program where families like swap houses, live for a year in each other's shoes. And, you know, if everyone in the country did that on like a 5-year rotating basis, exactly. I think our country would be much more functional, right?
Totally. And if at the least, it would, I think, make for good reality television. So,
oh gosh. Well, one last thing. Interestingly, you have had a more stereotypical, like Old West experience than most people who live in the American West. Even the people who really consider themselves Westerners, none of them have gone and tried to homestead in rural mountains of Idaho. So my question, do you consider yourself a Westerner?
I feel like the way I describe the book is as an insider's perspective written by an outsider. I definitely don't feel like I ever became like a real sort of Idahoan, you know? I don't know if that's
Did you get cowboy boots?
Term. I didn't get cowboy boots, but my dad, when he visited, did get some cowboy boots and a cowboy hat.
Did he pull that old cowboy hat out that he got in Oklahoma?
He did.
All
yeah,
right.
the picture that's in the book, that I use a reference photo of him wearing that cowboy hat. You know, I just also don't feel like cowboy boots look good on me. But I do feel like I got that sort of insider's perspective and this greater appreciation for what it means to be a Westerner, even if I don't know if I can fully, claim to be that, because I did in the end up, leaving that for the city, even though the city is still in the West. But I think it's like an ever evolving appreciation for it.
Well, do you want to tell us about what you're working on now? How are you keeping yourself busy?
Yeah, so a little less cartooning and more comic. So I made the jump from single panel New Yorker cartoons to an entire 288-page comic book. And so I've given myself this year to just do more short form comics. And I've been doing a lot of this for the New Yorker and the LA Times. And those have been more about being an Iranian American and being a father. I think every person who has a child ends up all of their stories end up revolving around being a parent and their kid. And so I've been exploring some of that in my comics. And I'm working on, book number 2. A friend of mine joked that this book was called This Country, that one should be called That Country. And it's going to be exploring some more of that, of parenthood and being an Iranian American, things that develop directly from my experience of being in Idaho. But then I still occasionally get around to doing, silly cartoons of animals in bed. Which, usually don't even go to the New Yorker because I'll know that they'll reject it, but end up on my Instagram. But definitely just sort of exploring post fatherhood, comics right now. Yeah, those themes.
Well, it sounds great. Thanks so much for spending some time with us. Congrats on the book. Congrats on it's gotten quite a few best book of the year lists.
It's been
accolades. It's been great.
Nice. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. And maybe someday we'll cross paths in Salt Lake or in Idaho at a rodeo. I'll let you know if I head up there for one. No. All right. Thanks, Navied. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, or follow us on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast, or on Twitter at Writing West, where you can get updates and leave comments. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We're an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understandings about the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream, have an annual funding cycle with award, grant, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product can apply. Learn more at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's REDD Center. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. Find him at Micah Dahl Anderson with an O.com. I'll put a link in the episode description. My name is Brendan Rensink. I serve as the podcast host, producer, and just about everything else, so you can direct any praise or critique my way. I'm author and editor of a number of books on the West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, and the environment. Recently, my book, Native But Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, published by Texas A&M University Press in 2018, won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America. In an anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen, entitled Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, published by the University of Utah Press in 2019, won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association. Here at the Redd Center, I'm also general editor and project manager of a great digital history, public history project named Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written microhistories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink, that's RENSINK.org, or follow me on Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, and be kind. Cheers.